Readers, Happy New Year and welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Today, we are going to be talking about Álvaro Enrigue's incredible new novel, You Dreamed of Empires. I'm a huge fan of Álvaro Enrigue. I read Muerte Súbita when it came out. I don't know, this was like kind of mid-COVID that I finally found this book, and I loved it. Many of you know that I don't have the very best memory, but I always have a very strong feeling about a book. And my feeling about this book was that it was really smart, really funny, and I remember it being really long in a very, very good way, when it actually doesn't actually seem super long when I'm going back and looking at it. And You Dreamed of Empires is even more slim, but what's interesting to me about this book is how just absolutely rich and how incredibly full it is of things that I wanted to unpack. We're sort of continuing in this vein that began with my exploration of Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, moved on to The House of the Spirits, La Casa de los Espíritus, and here we are at You Dreamed of Empires. So it is definitely not a straight line, but I'm really enjoying yet another deep dive into literature that is coming out of South and Central America. I must admit that the first time I picked it up on a table at my local independent bookstore, I was not entirely drawn in. The idea of really diving into this dilated moment of the first contact between Hernán Cortés and Moctezuma was not grabbing me. It just was not something that I was really excited about. So I actually dove into the book when I saw that it was included in that list of 10 best books of 2024 by the New York Times. And that was such good company. We had All Fours by Miranda July and James by Percival Everett. And honestly, I could not get enough of this book. I also had the feeling right away that I needed to do some kind of lecture about it because there's so much to unpack. So those of you who like an agenda, what we're going to do today, a very, very brief bio of Enrigue. I've been listening to a lot of interviews with him. And honestly, he sounds like the nicest person. I also just looked up his birth date and everything on Wikipedia. That's where I go for my author bio information. And he's born 19 days before I was, on August 6th of 1969. So he's 55 years old, was born in Guadalajara, but moved to Mexico City when he was like 3 weeks old. Honestly, there you go. That's the bio of Enrigue. The only thing I will add, and this was really interesting to me, is that he was married to Valeria Luiselli, who wrote the absolutely incredible Lost Children archive. This book, honestly, it's so incredibly haunting and incredibly sophisticated and just engrossing and different and original. It's just like, it's an unbelievable book. So very much like Danzy Senna, who wrote Colored Television and is married to Percival Everett, we have this kind of, power couple, this literary power couple with Valeria Luiselli and Álvaro Enrigue, but they're divorced now. Nonetheless, I was very interested in the idea of the person who would have written Lost Children Archive as having been very much in the same orbit as Álvaro Enrigue. So there's your bio. So beyond the bio, we are going to dive into just the absolute radical premise of this book. What Enrigue is doing here is really, it's kind of an insane thing to take this one moment and dilate it the way that he has done. And we're going to look at that as such a radical proposition. We're then going to talk about the title, the epigraph, and this list of characters. You can imagine that I was very taken by the idea of translation. I was actually a little frustrated. I could not get my hands on a copy of Tu Imperio Sueños Han Sido, which is the original title of the work in Spanish. I couldn't, literally no one had a paperback copy of this, which seems so bizarre to me. I finally found an electronic copy. But even just looking at the translation of the title, which I know exactly what that was in Spanish, and I know what it is in English. Just looking at that was fascinating. So we're going to take a little bit of a dive into the title. Also, of course, the epigraph, which is hugely important in this book. From that, we're going to move to this idea of cultural relativism. So I just this morning was listening to a final interview with Enrigue, and he was talking about how he really always wanted Moctezuma to win. That very much, if you're driving in a cab, in Mexico City, it's a very open question. It's sort of like, the way that he framed it was like often the question is like, are you with Cortés or are you with Moctezuma? So in many of these colonial situations, you have this sense of things as being very firmly in the past and not having an open question. So it was very interesting to me the way that he manages to make us feel, respect and compassion and disgust sort of equally for these two groups of people that are having this first contact, the Spaniards and the native people. So we're going to talk a little bit about his cultural relativism and how incredibly well that works. Then we're going to talk about dreaminess versus precision. Again, the title of the book is You Dreamed of Empires. And in many ways, the turn at the very end of the book has everything to do with dreams. So we're going to talk about the dreaminess, which to me was one of the real strengths of the book. And I wanted to dive into why it felt dreamy, why the prose and why the work felt the way that it did. We're then going to look briefly at language and all of these incursions. You could call them anachronistic, but there are all these incursions of kind of modern language that lend a lot to the humor of the book. We're going to discuss the humor when we're talking about the language. We're then going to take a quick look at how much we can consider this a feminist book. And then we're going to close with a discussion of the humor and then the final pages of the book. It's probably best for you to have read this book before you are diving into this conversation. There are going to be spoilers. Sometimes there are in lectures and sometimes there aren't. Not until the very end am I really going to discuss like the big turn in the book. And many people are already, in some ways it's a very interesting proposition because you sit down with this book and you're like, okay, sort of ultimately, as someone who, grew up in California, I had this sense that Hernán Cortés is going to be the victor here. We all know, the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. It's literally like one of the things when we learn about the explorers, back in the day, this was a date that was very firmly ingrained for me. So ultimately we kind of know what's going to happen in the story. So the idea of spoilers is a little bit odd. But of course, I love that because I'm always more interested in the how than the what. I'm not that interested in sort of what happens. I'm interested in how it happens. And of course, I'm interested in the ways that any author, when they are writing historical fiction, is going to sort of push against what we know, what we know about the historical moment and how they're going to sort of try to stick to it faithfully. And again, these notions are so crazy, the idea of sticking faithfully to history because history itself is a bit wobbly. But of course, we do have facts and we have primary sources. And what Enrique does with them is absolutely fascinating. So when I did get my degree in Spanish and French literature, the Spanish part was very focused on the 20th century peninsular novel. So I wrote my dissertation about Carmen Martín Gaite, who was a 20th century writer in Spain, which could not have been further in many ways from the writing that is the source material for this book and the writing that Enrique is really, has always been very passionate about. And that would have been these primary sources that are written by people like Bernal Díaz y Castillo, who was writing about this moment. We also, of course, have a couple of letters of Hernán Cortés writing back to the King of Spain. We don't have indigenous writing about this moment. And so in some ways, what Enrique has done is kind of reverse engineer what this moment might have been like with an enormous amount of compassion and frankly, like a lot of championing of Moctezuma and the indigenous people. In fact, I'm already sort of talking about the first point, which is this radical proposition that is the book You Dreamed of Empires. So what he's doing, very sort of famously, if you've read any of the criticism, and certainly now if you have read the book, is he is taking this moment, this meeting between these two politicians, these two empire builders, and he's imagining what that initial moment would look like. I've been using the word dilation, and I actually think I probably got that from some sort of, one of the articles that I read, but it's a perfect word for it because what we're doing is we're having this moment about which very little is written. And certainly any of it that is written by Cortés is deeply biased and is in fact propaganda in many ways, which we will get to. But the idea of really having looked carefully at who these people are and then having done all of the hard work, not just the historical research, but the hard work of having put himself into the positions of these two men who are essentially politicians. They're essentially self-serving politicians trying to maintain and or create empire. He just has done this incredible job of making them feel immediate and human and funny and like stupid and gross and heroic. And I mean, it's just an absolute feat what he has done in terms of dilating this moment. So again, I just mentioned that my information about Cortés comes from literally like grade school information about the explorers. So in my mind, I had 1521. It was very interesting to realize at a couple of different spots that we were talking about November 8th of 1519. So my sense was like, wait, if the fall of Tenochtitlan is in 1521, then where are we here? What's happening here? And in an interview, Enrique makes it clear that what happens is Hernán Cortés comes and he is welcomed into the city of Tenochtitlan, this incredibly well-engineered, just feat of construction that was the headquarters of Moctezuma, which was this kind of, he was the head of many of these groups of indigenous people in what would become Mexico at this point, in the beginning of the 16th century. So Hernán Cortés is welcomed in, and there's an 8-month period where he is is sort of essentially like the house guests of Moctezuma, and then things get, violent and crazy, and then we have this military conflict between the two of them. So it's funny, I, in many ways, didn't even consider this book historical fiction. It didn't feel like that to me, in part because it is such a specific look at this moment that was absolutely enormously important, but it wasn't a lot about, this is not big battles, and it's not big strategy, and it's not big swaths of history and swaths of people. It's very much focused on these small groups of people who are coming together at this absolutely enormous moment. It was very interesting to listen to a couple of the interviews when Enrique was talking about the importance of this moment. So we say first contact now. We don't say the conquest, not even explorers. I don't know what we're supposed to call them now. Maybe explorers. I don't know, the valence of that word. But the idea of first contact is Enrique's favored term for this meeting of these people. And I think it's a very good one. So he talks about how absolutely monumental this is, because this first contact between this very established group of indigenous people in what would become Mexico are meeting with the Spaniards. And really, this is the beginning of globalization, and it's the beginning of global trade. So this is something that was a little bit outside the scope of the book, but in many ways, it enhances the idea of this moment as being hugely important. You get the sense of its importance sort of through osmosis as you are reading the book. But later, when Enrique is talking about this idea that it is what opened trade, it's opened trade with Central America and Europe, but also because in Mexico you would have access to the Pacific Rim, it also opened trade with Asia. So it's this hugely important moment in terms of globalization and in terms of trade that in many ways kind of marks the modern era. Even just knowing that, like just having that sort of idea in your head really speaks to the importance of this moment, and also to how impressive it is to me that such an engaging book can come out of just a very, very tiny slice of history. I mean, this is not about the fall of Tenochtitlan. It's not about those 8 months. It's very much about this meeting of essentially of these two empires, but mostly of these two men. And I actually don't want to move away from the idea of this moment without mentioning, and we're going to get to the idea of this novel as being feminist later, but mentioning that in terms of this meeting of these two men, one of the things that for me was so central is that it linked with each of these two men is a woman. So we have both, the princess, who is the sister and the wife of Moctezuma, who is hugely important and instrumental in the book. And then we also have Malin, who was the translator and also, the lover and the sort of helpmeet of Cortés. And these two women, were really part and parcel with this moment, and hugely important in terms of demonstrating who these men were, but also demonstrating their absolutely crucial roles in this really decisive moment in history. But one of the things that was most interesting to me about the book is this kind of cultural relativism. So part of me was so curious about, I can't imagine writing a novel in 2024 The book was actually written some years ago and was translated and then was distributed, obviously, in 2024. I can't imagine publishing a book in 2024 that's like super like pro-colonial, that just like really, hands it to Cortez and is like, isn't that great? I mean, I think thankfully we have reached a moment in this kind of post-colonial world where we are beginning to realize how absolutely destructive these colonial forces were and all of this empire building, and how so much was lost as these empires just kind of rolled over these native peoples in all sorts of different ways. I mean, as an American, I'm acutely aware of how awful the colonial influence is. So I was very interested to see, sort of like how Enrique was going to present this conflict. There was sort of a resounding, victory in many ways on the part of the Spaniards. And I was very curious to see how he was going to do this. And it was even more fascinating than I thought. This is where cultural relativism comes in. So the idea of cultural relativism is just this idea that you need to look at a culture on its own terms and kind of in its own context. So instead of looking at, the habits and the systems of the indigenous people in Mexico. I keep saying that because I like there was the Triple Alliance and we have the Mexica people, and the names in the book were tricky on some level. I really enjoyed parsing them out. I did have one friend who's a very good reader, and she's like, I can't do it. I can't keep the names straight, which, I mean, fair. But I myself really enjoyed this idea, and it's very clear that Enrique, part of the book is this exposure to Nahuatl and to the different indigenous words and the different indigenous titles, and really sort of, having the reader do a little bit of work in a way that I find incredibly compelling. So this idea of cultural relativism is that we're not going to look at these indigenous peoples through, a colonial lens and be like, oh my God, how disgusting that they, had human sacrifice. We're going to look at their culture as much as we can through their own eyes, and also look at all sorts of different elements of it, not just the one thing that is fascinating to, in a very propagandistic way, to the colonial people of the moment. And what he did was so fascinating to me. So throughout the book, we have a third-person narrator, and sometimes it's a very close third-person narrator, meaning it's telling us, the thoughts and the reactions of an individual person. It's not saying I did this and I did that, but it's saying, that Atotochtli was, thinking this and thinking that. So we have this third-person narrator, and it switches back and forth between, essentially being kind of on the side or in the point of view of the Spaniards, but then equally we see this kind of perspective taking on the part of Moctezuma and his group of people, all of the indigenous peoples. So it's hugely important. We talk a lot on the Fox page about narrative stance. So the narrative stance here is third person, but it is very close to all of the different players. And I really loved the way that Enrique gave kind of equal time. The airtime seemed to me very equal between the native peoples and the Spaniards. So he talked in one of the interviews about how important this was to sort of give voice to all of these people. And he talked about trying to have it be very balanced. I was fascinated by the idea that we began with the Spaniards. So in the very beginning, you have that arresting opening where a few of the Spanish, explorers, they're having a meal next to these priests. And, the priests smell terrible and they have, blood caked on them. And it's so unappetizing and so unsettling that one of the Spaniards is having a very hard time eating his soup. So we very much in the beginning see these people as repellent and as very, very different from the Spaniards themselves. And in many ways, that repellent nature is very strong. And my sense was like, whoa, God, are we going to, is this going to be just like a colonial thing? Which obviously it did not. Enrique went well beyond just this perspective in the beginning. So we begin with the voice of the Spaniards. We have to begin with the voice of someone. And it actually does make sense to me because we are moving into Tenochtitlan with Hernán Cortés. It makes sense that we would have his perspective. He's someone who's moving into this, with fresh eyes. But the other thing that happened is even in the very beginning, even in that first chunk, when we are looking through the point of view of the Spaniards, which obviously it sort of makes us a little more sympathetic to them, we also learn very quickly that the princess who was there, Moctezuma's wife, Atotochtli, that she's kind of in on this, that she also thinks that these priests are repellent. And she also thinks that it would be very difficult to have lunch with them because when they are in their full ceremonial garb, it is difficult to be eating because of the way that they smell and the way that they look. So we have this sense of the culture. I mean, they're very, very different, obviously, hugely different cultures and have very different customs. But one of the things that comes out, of course, is that like the Spaniards are just as gross as the native people. They don't wash. They're very sort of, ham-fisted when it comes to some of the customs. There's that one amazing time when Hernan Cortes tries to hug Moctezuma, which is a hugely offensive thing. They're a little oafish. They certainly are arrogant and think that they have more power than they actually do in many ways. And there's so many times when the native people, and certainly when Tenochtitlan is portrayed as being so orderly and so evolved and so sophisticated and incredibly clean, those beautiful descriptions of the flower petals, it's in this very sort of evolved sense of weaving fabric and different ceremonial things. It's like a very sophisticated culture that the Spaniards are walking into. And mostly we see the Spaniards as being like inept and like all of how long it takes them to get their stuff all going. And there's the one guy who's cutting his toenails and you just are like, ew, gross. Like those toenails had to have been repulsive. Not quite in the same way as being caked with blood as a priest at a lunch, but still, he does this amazing job of making us see both positive things and negative things in the culture of both of these people, which is hugely important. And I was really impressed. There was one point in the book where this idea of the native peoples as being very civilized really came to the fore in a way that both struck me as kind of funny. The book is really, really funny in so many ways. I mean, I think the humor was secondary to all of the amazing other stuff that was happening, but it's definitely there. And you see a bit of it in the tone of what I'd like to read right now. So this is on page 118, and this is Moctezuma talking. He said, "I want the Castilteca. It may be risky to bring them here, but their presence has only increased since we first heard of them, which means that ignoring them is not just a risk, but a real danger. If anyone is going to have them, it must be us. And if we civilize them, they will be an ornament for the city. So I love this idea of like, if we civilize them, which is sort of a distillation of this very real feeling that you have throughout the book, that this floating city, Tenochtitlan, and all the people in it are incredibly sophisticated and very civilized, which really flies in the face of, this idea of the Spaniards, educating and civilizing, these people who are not, in fact, already civilized. So I really enjoyed that idea of really in halfway through the book of stating what Moctezuma would have thought, which is like, we really need to civilize these people. So we have, moments throughout that are subtle and then less subtle. But one thing I did want to talk about too is this idea of human sacrifice. And, I in my mind, I think I have a vision of like from like Raiders of the Lost Ark or something, where there's like some, priest-ish guy who like literally reaches a hand into someone's chest and pulls out his heart or something. And in my memory, that Raiders of the Lost Ark vibe was very much like you might imagine, like when I think of Machu Picchu or when I think of like I'm imagining like a ziggurat. Now I'm just mixing together a whole bunch of different, indigenous people's like incredibly sophisticated architecture. But to me, it felt like they were on a rocky outcropping that was, very imposing, but did feel a bit like these ruins that we have in South America. So my touch point for this human sacrifice was like Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is very deep. And I'm sure it was very like colonial in lots of ways and not sensitive to the native peoples with, among whom this was a practice. So in one of the interviews, the woman who's interviewing Enrigue is like, I really want to talk about, the elephant in the room. Like, let's just get right straight to the human sacrifice. And he made such a compelling argument that I'm going to sort of boil down for you here, which is that, yes, there was human sacrifice. And he's not like a proponent of human sacrifice, obviously, but he viewed it in sort of this within the context of what was happening. Also, it's incredibly important to remember that the Spanish versions of what was happening in Tenochtitlan were incredibly propagandistic. So it's, what Hernan Cortés is writing back to Carlos V is this totally biased thing, from those primary sources. If we believe that those are accurate, then, the idea of this insanity, of this human sacrifice would just grow and grow. So he was speaking about one, estimate of how many human sacrifices had happened in this moment of time, in this space. And it's totally impossible. It's like someone did the math, and you would have to be having a human sacrifice every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day in order to reach the numbers that these people, these historians, are quoting. So there's this idea that the number of human sacrifice was incredibly inflated because, in order for these colonial forces to feel good about, civilizing the indigenous people, you would need to make them feel very kind of savage. I'm using savage in air quotes there. The other thing that aligns with this idea of propaganda is that Moctezuma is married to his sister. So literally, when I looked at the list of characters and it says, Atotochtli, and then she's Moctezuma's sister and wife, I literally put a little exclamation mark in the marginalia, which is exactly what, the Spaniards wanted you to think, and it's exactly what Enrique wants you to think. Because it is very different from our customs, certainly, in the whatever, since, I don't know, the Victorian era. I don't know how long it's been that you can't marry your cousin. I actually think in California, I literally think you can marry your first cousin. We were just discussing this, not for any real practical reason, but it did come up. But what's important, and what Enrique talks about in one of the interviews, is that this would have been, it's very much like these European royalty who had lots and lots of in marriage, and they're marrying close cousins and whatever, and probably some brothers and sisters. This is not like a Cersei and Jaime Lannister thing. This is not like an incredibly erotic, taboo incestual thing. This would have been a very strategic marriage between these two people. And in fact, I think, Moctezuma is 10 or 15 years older than Atotochtli. And we do get the sense of these, as the two of them as being real power players. But what's one of the things that's important here is that when Cortés is later, after he's been hanging out with them for 8 months, and finally, when he's wanting to sort of make his charge and take over the city, he has to make them seem terrible. So the things that he leans into is this idea of Moctezuma having married his sister, and also of this human sacrifice. So, and again, Enrique is not some big proponent and excusing human sacrifice, but he is trying to put it in perspective. The other way that he puts it into perspective is to think about war, and to think about the ways in which European war was killing so many people. He did not mention the Inquisition, but that is where my mind went. I was I'm not sure that the Catholic Inquisition, probably better than human sacrifice, but I don't know. If you're going to sacrifice one, human every once in a while versus, the Inquisition, I think it's maybe a toss-up. I don't know. I mean, I'm speaking a little bit out of school, but I'm also pointing to the fact that it would be very easy to find these things that are not part of the European culture, and to really expand them and to make them a much bigger deal, and to play up this kind of savagery, when in fact there was a lot of stuff happening in Spain at the time that was not all that savory. Okay, we're finally going to dive into the book. I want to take a second to look at the title. Honestly, I could talk 90 minutes about the title, and I am going to refrain. It comes from a 17th century play by this guy named Pedro Calderón. The play is called La vida es sueño, Life is a Dream. This is a book that I actually did read in graduate school because it is a real touchstone for a lot of what comes after. It was a play, and essentially it's about this Polish prince who's stuck in this castle, which seems kind of crazy until you think about the fact that Carlos V, who was the king, who came just after Isabel and Fernando and Isabella, but he was a Holy Roman Empire, king. He was not this. He was Charles. He was from somewhere, I don't know, in Germany or something. So you have to think, a little differently about what was happening in Europe at the time. when all of this kind of exploration is happening and when all of this empire building is happening. So there's this very important play that is from Calderon. It's a book that is very much about what is reality and what is dreaming and fate and this idea of like how much control do humans have. It's really impressive and like very prescient kind of play in terms of thinking of some very, very big ideas that are very much at the core of a lot of literature. And I love the fact that the original title was taken from that. So the original title is Tu Imperio Sueños Han Sido. And there are a couple of differences that I think are really important. So one of them is that Tu Imperio Sueños Han Sido, for me, one of the things that stands out about that is tu imperio is a casual way. It's an intimate way of saying it's the second person, informal. It's a more intimate kind of address. It's not like, Your Majesty, your empire has been a dream. It's a much more sort of personal, intimate address. So, and for me, it also kind of like it conjures a dialogue. So this idea of like tu sueño, imperios han sido, tu imperio. I keep doing that, which honestly, it kind of makes sense both ways. But tu imperio, sueños han sido, to me, there's like one person who's saying your empire, and then dreams it has been. So the other thing is that imperios han sido, oh my gosh, I'm going to keep doing that. Sueños han sido. First of all, they're more than one. It's dreams. And sueños can also mean goals. For me, I mean, I'm obviously not a Spanish native speaker, but the idea of sueños, it's not so much like a goal, like your dream, whereas in the English, I think you dreamed of empires, this idea sort of not just that you like had a dream about them, but it's like it was a goal for you. For me, the English version, you dreamed of empires, is a bit more like you may have had a dream about them, but mostly like your goal was to have empires. Whereas the Spanish, for whatever reason, for me, tu imperio sueños han sido, it's a little bit more of like it has been part of this dreaminess. It also may be just that I know that it's from Calderon, who was, very preoccupied with the idea of actual dreams. But the plural is interesting to me. Tu imperio, sueños han sido. So more than one dream, which is very different than you dreamed of empires. It's not a verb. It's not you dreamed. It is in fact a noun. Your empire dreams have been. It's also this present progressive han sido. The idea of the perfecto in Spanish, han sido, it's like has been. It's so beautiful and it is so complicated in many ways. It's so nuanced in the Spanish. I mean, like a terrible and kind of ugly direct translation would be your empire dreams have been, meaning that they are still continuing to be. Whereas you dreamed of empires, it's like you dreamed of empires, it's over, it's firmly in the past. So I love the Spanish. I love the idea of the nuance there of tu imperio sueños han sido as something that it's still happening. Your dreams are still occurring a little bit. One very quick note on the translation, slightly more broadly, is every time Álvaro Enrigue talks about Natasha Wimmer, he just has you can just tell how incredibly well they work together. Apparently they do actually work together. There's a lot of collaboration that goes on. And he said the most interesting thing about the English versions, which is that they're always longer. So he will, he'll write the thing in Spanish, and then over time he'll be thinking more about it while Natasha's doing her thing. And I think it sounds like Natasha, who sounds amazing, also is, and his editor, both of them are sort of, continuing to think about the novel. And so then he ends up adding things in English, which makes me all the more frustrated that I cannot seem to get my hands on an original copy of Tu Imperio Sueños Han Sido. But I have it electronically, but literally I just cannot read fiction on my computer. I don't know, I cannot do it. Anyway, he also had this hilarious thing where he was saying that he was writing some of these editions in English. And then when he gave them to Natasha, she's like, oh my God, please keep writing in Spanish. Like, I would rather have your Spanish to translate into English than have you trying to write in English, which was so funny to me and sort of humble and lovely to think about with the two of them and their working relationship. So I do think there are different nuances in the titles. I mean, I am not a translator and certainly can't claim to have any better idea, but I am very interested in the differences. And I think it is important to realize that this source material, this play that was written, 100 years later, but has everything to do with what is dream and what is reality. So if we just take a step back and think about the title, You Dreamed of Empires, there's this very cool thing that's happening there where the reader, you have this idea of you dreamed of empires. There's kind of an implicit thing that when you say you, in that case, you're talking about the reader. And the reader is, in fact, in many ways kind of along for the ride in what feels very dreamy. And then what I think is even more important and is certainly, intact in the English version of the title is at the very end of the book, there is an actual dream. We have a couple of naps, the way the structure works. Oh, I wish we had more time to talk about structure and all the rest of it. But we have, Moctezuma having a nap, and then we have the dream of Cortés. We have these different, references to actual dreams that are hugely important. And in fact, with Cortés, at the end of the book, the dream that he has about empire is in fact exactly what happens in history. But this idea of you dreamed of empires, he is describing this incredibly inventive ending of the book, which is when Cortés is dreaming of empires that in fact, very happily do not come to fruition because in many ways, the book felt to me like it had two endings. Like we had Cortés and we had this kind of, again, it's not a dilation here. It was kind of like this expansion. I guess it's a dilation of him, from 1519 all the way to the present day, to whenever Enrique was writing this book on Fire Island. You had this huge look at history. And as a reader, I was like, oh God, is that it? Like, is this really what's going to happen? And I was a bit disappointed. And then we have the final ending, which is so incredibly gratifying. But it does remain, the importance of the title is so good. And I appreciate it both in Spanish and in English. It's just, as far as I'm concerned, an incredible title. So we're, in the very beginning, it feels like we're very firmly, sort of in the terrain, especially once we know that the title comes from a 17th century Spanish play. It does feel very colonial. But then we have this beautiful epigraph that I was so... I can't say I was so moved by the epigraph because it was very specific, but I was so intrigued by it. And I was very moved by the fact that this was something that came from the Nahuatl. So it came from the language and the culture that is an indigenous culture. And one of them, the language certainly that Moctezuma, that a lot of this, these negotiations and this politics is all happening in. And talk about translation. You have all these different translators, that are so important. And the idea of language is so important throughout the entire book. But we have this epigraph that I think very nicely balances this very kind of colonial feeling title. So I'm going to read the epigraph, and some of you guys who, even if you are a very careful reader, you might have read right over the top of this and not recalled it, which is what I did. So the epigraph at the beginning has to do with the ant, with this kind of, fable of the ant. And it turns out that this fable of the ant, or the story of the ant, is hugely important throughout the entire novel. And I had not, in fact, read carefully enough to realize that we are given this story of the ant at the very, very beginning. So I'm going to read it to you, and keep in mind that this is, this is something that was originally written in one of the many, many native languages of the people in what is today Mexico. So here we go. Again, they asked, "What will the gods eat? Everyone is looking for food." Then the ant went to collect kernels of corn from the mountain of sustenance. Quetzalcoatl met the ant and said to him, "Tell me where you got that." Many times he asked, but the ant wouldn't tell. Then the ant said, "Over there." Legend of the Suns, 1558. So it also, it is not attributed here. It doesn't say originally in Nahuatl. I don't know how I know that, but I have in my thing here that originally it was in Nahuatl. It's interesting to me that Enrique is not telling us that. He's also not, right from the beginning, he's not making it super obvious that the line that becomes the title is from a, colonial play. But I love the idea of the title, which is very colonial, as being balanced by this epigraph. And epigraphs, some of them are more important than others. This one is hugely important. It in many ways, it is informing a lot of what happens with the rest of the play. This idea of, the rest of the novel, the idea of like not telling and not telling and not telling and then finally telling. I think in some ways we can look at that as the resistance on the part of Moctezuma and all of the people in Tenochtitlan, the idea of resisting, and then, sort of succumbing to this giant army of Spanish soldiers who end up coming in, with their horses and their rifles and all the rest of it. I actually wasn't really privy to this, but I, apparently, again, I should have paid more attention both in like 5th grade and then also in graduate school. The sort of propaganda, again, is that somehow the entire enormous, sophisticated city of Tenochtitlan was taken over by like 300 Spaniards, which is absolutely not true. Apparently, they had swollen the Spanish army to be hugely, really dense and very skilled and well armed and all of that. So this idea that somehow the fall of Tenochtitlan, that these people were weak, was entirely apocryphal. So the last thing I will say before we move away from the title is just that in the acknowledgments, Enrique talks about how some of the structure of the story, his novel, and some of the sort of feel of the novel comes from a story by Borges called The Secret Miracle. So in that, it has in many ways, it shares some of the preoccupations of La Vida es Sueño by Calderón, in the sense that it's someone at the end of his life who is able to stop time and have things kind of dilate. But it's this idea of free will, it's this idea of dreams, it's the idea of, sort of the nature of reality, which lots and lots of Borges is very much about all of these different things, not to mention authorship and the nature of literature. So I loved the fact that there were all of these different literary, sort of large, literary shoulders that Enrique is building upon in ways that are very subtle. And in the case of the Nahuatl, like it's fairly anonymous in some ways, and yet hugely important that we are having the native voices together with the title that comes from Calderón and all of these different sort of structural pieces that are in some ways inherited from Borges. So I really enjoyed, not to mention all of the different echoes of the chivalric novels. At one point, Enrique talks about how the way that these men were thinking and writing about this first contact had everything to do with these chivalric novels. Think knights and damsels in distress, and that sort of heroic narrative really informed the way that they were writing about this. So it is a book that is not only dreamy and amazing and hilarious, but it is also one that is deeply saturated in all sorts of literature. So I said we were going to move away from the title, but not quite yet, because there's this very important thing I want to touch on, and I alluded to it before, which is why this novel feels so dream-like. And I really did a lot of thinking about this, because obviously, the title is You Dreamed of Empires. We are preoccupied with the idea of dreaminess, but I loved the way that the novel itself felt to me like I was dreaming it. And also you can think about hallucination. I mean, lots of what we hear about Moctezuma, and this is all historically based, is that there was a lot of hallucinogens happening. And in fact, at the end of the book, the Spaniards are also, in a sort of hallucinatory state. So in many ways, the book itself, the entire thing, feels a bit like a hallucination or like a dream. And my sense about that is partially we have this very kind of narrow, it's not exactly narrow, but it's a very specific and very sort of the parameters of what we are seeing are fairly tight. Meaning, when we're having the lunch in the beginning, we have a very detailed description of these priests, but we aren't exactly sure where we are in time or in space, and we don't have a comprehensive look at Tenochtitlan. Our vision is so sort of narrow in a great way. It's like we really are only seeing what Hernán Cortés is seeing at that moment. We're not even necessarily seeing what he saw when he first was coming in. The idea of a floating city, to me, is still very hard to sort of capture. And we don't have time to go into this, but the book in terms of time is very circular. So we have all of these different, at the very beginning of the book, there's reference to Cortés as having tried to hug Moctezuma and what a disaster that is. And that moment comes up several different times throughout the novel. And each time there's a bit of a different nuance. So it's this very skilled and incredibly sophisticated way that Enrique is meting out the information and what is happening in the story. But it is sort of dreamlike because you keep returning to these events that you're not entirely understanding. There's also this thing where we have details where we're envisioning, a lot of the book to me felt very maze-like. Like I could picture a pool that they were swimming in, and I could picture the walls and sort of the cleanliness and this idea that we were in this giant labyrinth of all of these different hallways and all of these different suites and these different rooms and these different swimming pools. But I couldn't, I sort of had a sense of what it was around me, but I couldn't really picture it super accurately. We didn't get like a realist description at the beginning. There was no like John Steinbeck thing where we're starting with the camera pulled way back and we're like moving into the Salinas Valley, and he's describing the Salinas Valley, and then he's describing the homes, and then we're getting closer and closer into the people. Here we are beginning with the people and with their sense of confusion and their sense of being in a world that they don't quite understand, which is exactly how you feel in a dream. They're also, because of some of the language, there's that very nice note that Enrigue includes, that is his note to Natasha Wimmer. But he says, don't worry too much about the Nahuatl words because you'll begin to understand them. The human brain likes to figure out these puzzles. So there were a few things. There was something called a pe'ek. I don't know how you pronounce that. It's like P''C maybe. And I got the sense eventually that it was kind of like a clothing valet, like maybe, but at first I thought it was like a piece of material. So again, some of this language that I loved kind of not quite figuring it out and having to understand from the context clues, that also is very dreamlike. It's like you kind of know what a huipil is, the thing that Atotochtli is wearing, but you're also kind of not entirely sure. So there's a dreamy sense of even the understanding of language. There's that sense of sort of not of being a little confused the way that you sometimes are in a dream. And lastly, I think one of the things that makes dreams, feel like dreams is you have a certain familiarity, and then things are, but they're different. It's sort of like, oh, it was my house, but it like actually wasn't anything like my house. That notion of things being familiar and being just deeply unfamiliar, you have that feeling throughout the entire thing. It's like, you know what a pool looks like, and you know what a flower looks like, and you know what a bowl of soup looks like, but you get the sense that each one of these things is not the way that you are actually picturing it. So this idea of the dream as being pervasive was so compelling to me. And I think largely it is because of that familiar feel. Like so many of the things that are important felt familiar to me. And a lot of that was literally just like human bodies in space and human bodies having different conversations and sort of gossipy interactions, or really dire interactions, or interactions between, spouses. Those things all felt familiar. And so I had a lot to anchor myself onto, but also this idea that I wasn't meant to be picturing, this entire thing in this comprehensive way. That was not the goal. The goal was, in fact, to be seeing, glimpses of things in a way that felt more honest to me. And in fact, more, it's like I didn't have quite as much to keep track of. So it was kind of liberating in some ways. I could focus more on the language and on the interactions between the people instead of having to expend a lot of energy like in envisioning what, these altars looked like or what the meal actually looked like. So I found it very, very liberating. There was even this moment, speaking of things being familiar and unfamiliar, when I realized that the word that they were, the Nahuatl word for horse, the caballos, now that I'm saying it out loud, it's so obvious to me, is caballos. So you have this sense of for them, the idea of a horse is so strange. It's this strange animal that is sort of tame, but is obviously very, crucial in terms of being able to move people around. It's this entire, Moctezuma, I think very correctly realizes that it's a real strategic asset on the part of the Spanish. But it was so funny at some point, I don't know, like I'd seen caballos, which, spelled CAHUA or something like that, YOS. On the page, it didn't look familiar. And then finally I was like, oh my gosh, he's talking about the caballos. So you have this sense of the familiar as things that are unfamiliar, as sort of becoming familiar. Sometimes it happens like that in dreams and sometimes it doesn't. But I really appreciated the way that for these Spaniards, and for the native peoples, that so much of this would feel unfamiliar, but gradually they would begin to understand what is happening. And it was so cool the way that one word did exactly that for me. I did not know what caballos was until I, in fact, realized what it was. And I loved that it had to do with language and with translation. It was just really such an excellent moment. So I really wish we had 90 minutes just to talk about the incredible prose, but I want to just touch on one aspect that to me was so curious and I think eventually was very telling, and it fits perfectly with what I was just saying about details and small images as being both familiar and unfamiliar. And that is this. In the back of my book, whenever I'm reading something that is interesting and difficult, I'll start writing little notes, and then I'll write page numbers that correspond. And one of the notes I wrote was posture. So I kept coming across these moments where, you would have this kind of unfamiliar sense of like, these Spaniards sitting down to lunch with a bunch of priests, and I would not be able to locate it very well, you sort of in my mind's eye. And then we would have these details that often had to do with posture and had to do with the body and how people were sitting or standing that was so specific that it would bring me right to that person, both in the sense of being able to see it, but also in the sense of being able to kind of feel what that would feel like as a human being. It was very humanizing in lots of ways. So I'm going to read 2 examples. This is on page 49. The major of the Arquebusier company. I mean, there's another word, like that's a Spanish colonial word. I don't know what that is. I mean, he's a major, so it's some sort of military title, but I don't know what the Arquebusier is. And that is very clearly, some sort of European word. So it's great that we have this in both directions. We don't understand all of the native words, and we also apparently don't understand all of the translated Spanish words. So we have here, the major of the Arquebusier company, Arquebusier? I don't know. Company was slow to heed their call because he was cutting his toenails. Perhaps the only act of hygiene considered vital on campaign. So a couple of things here. One is like the idea of someone cutting their toenails. That is very vivid to me. I can totally see that. We also have a little poke at the Spaniards here in the sense that like if that's the only hygiene they're doing, that's a major problem. Also, cutting toenails is just gross. Like ugh, So we have this idea here of something that is deeply familiar, and you can definitely picture this, although he's probably doing it with like a knife. He doesn't have those cute little nail clippers that we have now. So we have that idea of seeing him. And then at the very beginning of the next paragraph on 49, we have this. Leaning on their elbows on the wooden beam that served as balustrade, they pondered how easy it would be to get back to the stairs. So we have them confused. They're a little lost. They can't figure out. It's very maze-like, this situation that they're wandering through, and dangerous. But the idea of them leaning back with their elbows on what is a wooden balustrade, that kind of specific image was so helpful for me. And it was interesting because it's throughout the entire book. It's one of the ways in which Enrigue is most specific in his description. And for some reason, I really loved all of these postural elements. So there's another one on page 58. So this is when we have Malin in this private moment that to me humanized her, but also allowed me to sort of see myself in this world. And it's the specifics here that are interesting. You'll hear them as I read, but they're very, again, like they really stood out because they had to do with the human body and posture and things that bodies do. As she dried the insides of her ears with the linen cloth, Malin calculated the odds that the Captain General would come out on top when the spoils were divided, and she would once more be the lady of a realm. So here, this idea of just her drying the insides of her ears is, again, this kind of, it's like that very human, thing that we all do all the time, just like cutting our nails. And it's very specific in a way that really kind of brought her to life, that was very interesting to me. We also don't have a lot of time to talk about humor. The humor is very subtle. It's often very tongue-in-cheek. And Enrigue at one point made a comment in one of these interviews that it is crucial to have humor in a dictatorship. And in that case, he was talking about the very repressive, world of Mexico, where he lived as a young man. And I think this is a common idea, which is simply that when you have a dictatorship, and certainly when you have people controlling the media, that humor is one way to be a bit subversive. So there's lots of humor throughout, but I just want to touch on one thing, and it happens a couple of different times. So at some point, I think it's at the end of that very first scene when we have the lunch between the men, there is a point where our narrator says, "Looking good, Spain." And then a couple of, pages later, it's like, "Looking even better, Spain." And to my ear, it sounded very much like you would say that about a sports team. And the way, and it feels very kind of anachronistic in some ways. It's like suddenly we're talking about like a way that you would talk about a sports team in the 21st century or the 20th century. And I loved that. And that kind of lightening of an otherwise like very taut novel is really important. So also apparently Enrique teaches this course in like soccer. It's like how to understand Latin America through soccer, or Mexico through soccer. And he said it was such a charming thing in the interview. He's like, yeah, my class on like 16th century and 17th century literature is not very well subscribed. So he needed to have a course that was going to get him a few more people. He's a teacher at Hofstra University. He lives in New York. But sports is clearly very important to him. So this idea of kind of rooting the teams on, and speaking about it just in terms of a match, which also has to do with Muerte Súbita, which was all about tennis between Caravaggio and I don't know I can't remember now. God, that's terrible. Anyway, maybe you just were piqued. Maybe your interest was piqued. So good. But again, this kind of sports metaphor, very, very subtle here in You Dreamed of Empire. But that kind of subtlety and that sort of tongue-in-cheek is exactly the kind of humor that I think is so effectively leavening a book that is in fact very tense. So I want to end today with this idea of whether or not this book could be called feminist. It seems sort of odd to be placing like any kind of feminist lens onto a book that is really very much a meeting of these two leaders of empire, both of whom are men. But in both cases, there is a woman. In the case of Cortés, we have Malinali, and in the case of Moctezuma, we have Atotoxtli. These are women, I mentioned it before, who are hugely influential. So one of the things that Enrique makes much of in these interviews is the fact that Malinali is at the center of all of these conversations. So she was taken by the Maya people and she was made a slave, so she was able to speak Maya. She also speaks Nahuatl. So then she is, through Jazmín Caldera, who is the Spaniards translator, everything is being translated from Spanish to Maya or Nahuatl to Maya. But it's Malinali. Everyone is talking to her. So in many ways, she is the one who's controlling the conversation, and she's certainly helping to iron out nuance. You see that happening in the book itself. And you can imagine just the power that she has. You also realize, and a character in the book also realizes, that she is also learning to speak Castilian, Spanish. So she's very, very bright, and she is the one who really, without anyone knowing it, is informing herself of all of these very important things. So I was very interested. El Malinche was a name that I was very familiar with. I must have read something in my graduate studies where El Malinche is how you're referring to Cortés. But in my mind, I was like, wait, oh my God, El Malinche is the same as Cortés? So for me, that was kind of a more familiar name in this context than Cortés. Cortés, in my mind, all of those explorers are all kind of the same, and somehow they all get to like Cuba, and then I can't really remember where they go. So this idea of El Malinche as being much more, sort of memorable was fascinating to me, because it turns out that El Malinche, as a nickname for Cortés, comes from La Malinche or Malinali. So this idea, I love this. La Malinche comes first, and then he essentially is like known as like the guest, or not even the guest. It's like the lover of it's like he's known as like Mr. Malinali, but he's like taken her name, and that to me is so influential. This idea of her as having the kind of power where her name is essentially the way that Cortés is understood to be. I also was very interested. This is not something I knew, but I apparently in the recent past, the idea of being a Malinchista in Mexico has a lot to do with betrayal. So you can imagine, knowing what we know about Cortés and what happens with Moctezuma, we know, in fact, that Malinali could be seen as sort of traitorous because, in fact, she is aligning herself with the colonial forces. And Enrique speaks about this in a couple of the different interviews about how, she had no way to know what was going to happen. And for a long time, Moctezuma, for those 8 months, was also, somewhat hospitable to these people. And he makes the point that she's doing what she would have done for her children and herself. I mean, if nothing else, you get the sense of the precarity of life in this system. And if you're Malinali, who, have already been enslaved by the Maya people, you would really be looking out for number one and for your own children. And so if you need to align yourself with Cortés, then that is what you would do. Also, I didn't know this, and I just heard this morning, was that they have a child, I think it's Martin Cortez, who is known as like the first Mexican person. Because, oh my gosh, if you're on the YouTube, when I gave my air quotes there about first Mexican person, there was a celebration of Martin Cortez's birthday with balloons that suddenly came onto the screen there. But this person who is, whose father is Spanish and whose mother is a native person, would have been known as kind of the first person of Mexico. So in many ways, if she has a son who is a product of her union with Cortez, you would, in many ways, you would be sort of forced, if you were loyal to your child, you would be forced to align yourself with the Spanish forces. So, and I guess now people aren't saying Malinchista as much anymore, which thank goodness, and people are really rewriting her role. But for a long time, this idea of Malinche, La Malinche, had these sort of overtones of betrayal. And honestly, in some ways, the fact that that a term for a traitor was the name of this woman speaks to the power of the woman. I mean, you may not like her role in it, but certainly she had a major role in this incredibly important moment in the history of what is today Mexico. I mean, someone who's very, very important is their name is going to endure historically. And again, now we are re-envisioning her role, but certainly she was extremely important. We also, throughout the entire novel, have this sense that Atotochtli, who is Moctezuma's sister and wife, I mean, he's depressed. He is totally out of it because he is, taking all sorts of hallucinogenic drugs. He is desperate. He is, he's literally in bed, like pulling the covers over his eyes. Like those kinds of descriptions to me were so real and so compelling, just in terms of humanizing these people. But Moctezuma, you get this sense that he is really hurting and that he's highly, highly volatile. And so you have this woman who is essentially, the extension of him. She is the empire incarnate, and she is out negotiating with these people and finding out what is going on, and she's gathering information, and it's extremely important. At one point, they describe her as striding like a jaguar. So you have this sense of her importance. It's kind of inherent, it's like kind of implied in many ways, but also descriptions like that. I mean, you don't describe a character as striding like a jaguar unless they have a lot of power. So I think in many ways, these women end up being really, in some ways, very heroic. And it's very difficult to think of Moctezuma or to think of Cortez as being heroic, just knowing what we know about both of them. In some ways, it's much easier to elevate these women. Okay, in the interest of not talking for like a whole other hour about this book, I just want to list very briefly the things that I was really taken by, but was not, able to discuss completely here. Things like the questions of translation. I loved the letter that Enrigue includes and how he really is helping the reader understand both the importance of the Nahuatl words, but also, you can have kind of, patience with yourself. And there were only, as I'm reading through, if I'm reading something in English and there's kind of something that seems either very interesting to me, like, wow, how did she translate this? Like, what would the original have been? Most of the time I feel like I can kind of reverse engineer the Spanish. But if it's using a colloquial phrase or, an idiom, I'll in my mind, I'll be like, whoa, I wonder what the original is. And there are a couple of those where I was really interested in what Natasha Wimmer, it was interested in the translation. Most of it just felt to me like, I don't know, I just didn't even feel the presence of a translator, which is obviously what you want. We also didn't get to dig in as much as I would like into the idea of this influence of the chivalric novels or the idea of the source material. We talked a bit about La Vida es Sueño, but we could have done more. I also would really have loved to have dug into time in the novel, the way that it does loop, the way that we keep revisiting these key moments. It's dreamy, but it's also just incredibly compelling and structurally very inventive. I also would have really liked to have talked about the cover art. I'm holding it up for those of you on YouTube. It did at some point, probably right around the time that I realized that caballos was also caballos. It dawned on me that these horses were very important. And so I kind of was like, okay, that's what's happening on the cover. But for some reason, it also, I don't know. It's fine. The cover is fine. But I would have liked to have dug in a little more to the notion of these horses and the importance of the horses. And I would have really loved to have dug into the ending, but I loved the idea of really aligning with the underdogs. Like there was part of me that really, really wanted Moctezuma to have an ending that was very different from the one that we know historically. And again, I think I mentioned this before, but in the interview this morning, Enrigue was talking about how he really always has wanted Moctezuma to have won. So there's this tension throughout where you're playing with this idea of the native peoples as somewhat of an underdog. And finally, I will say the ending, I mean, I'm just going to speak about it in sort of general terms. It was incredibly satisfying to me. So I the whole time I was like, I'm wondering how much a history I'm actually going to get. Like, am I going to understand why we are on November 8th, 1519 and not 21? Like how, if at all, are we going to learn this history? And then there's that very, very satisfying thing where we run, in sort of 2 pages through all the history of what was going to happen. And it is so satisfying because a lot of it is very sort of minuscule and specific and detailed. And some of it is like, oh, right, I remember this. And I remember that from, grade school or high school or whatever. It's very, very satisfying to know that we're going to run not only through the history of, the fall of Tenochtitlan, but also kind of through all of history where Mexico is concerned, through the moment, which of course is this beautiful meta moment where we have Álvaro Enrigue writing the book on Fire Island. It was very satisfying to have the history laid out like that. And then the second ending was just like, it was so satisfying on so many levels. And you realize that it was set up in a bunch of different moments. Again, this circular, time in the novel. There's several different times where Moctezuma's brother is a big player. And then we have, it's very satisfying at the end. We feel like the ending is really earned and that you're both sort of like, oh my God, I can't believe it happened like that. And then you're also like, obviously it happened like that. So maybe that's a good note to end on. I also, I have 2 dogs here in the room with me and they're snoring so loudly. I'm not sure if you can hear that or not. But for some reason, that seems they've fallen asleep. It's maybe a good time for me to wrap up. So thank you so much for listening. And honestly, I was so happy to have an excuse to dive into this book. And I could go on for hours and hours, but I'm really hoping that the things I dug into were interesting and helpful in terms of a bit more comprehensive understanding of this amazing novel. So get yourself back to the Foxed page, find something else to listen to or to watch on YouTube, and happy reading.